A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Cam Edwards, your host. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. Glad to be with you today. On the program, we're going to debunk some of the arguments that we are starting to see here from gun control advocates that, gun stores are just really not that essential. There's no need for them to open, even though we've seen record numbers of gun sales. Anecdotally, it looks like we've got record numbers of new gun owners in this country. Clearly, the demand is high right now for folks wanting to exercise the right to keep and bear arms. But you've got a number of individuals out there, including a lot of basically every major gun control organization and a lot of individuals as well who are arguing that, hey, listen, now is the perfect time to order gun stores to close. Now is the perfect time to make it impossible for individuals to exercise their right to keep and bear arms. Ran across a piece out of Massachusetts, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. Has an op-ed by a professor of constitutional law at Suffolk University in Boston, Rene Reyes, who says that there are fallacies in the constitutional arguments raised by Second Amendment supporters. So let's go through some of what Professor Reyes has to say here, shall we? Take a look at this. Consider the claim, he says, made by the Second Amendment Foundation that no malady, however severe, can nullify or even temporarily suspend the exercise of a constitutionally delineated fundamental right. Professor Reyes says this claim is categorically and demonstrably false. The Supreme Court has consistently held that even the most fundamental of rights and liberties can be curtailed if the government has a sufficiently compelling interest. The right to keep and bear arms, he writes, is no exception. To the contrary, he goes on to say, even in the course of establishing a much more robust right of self-defense than had previously been recognized under U.S. constitutional law, the Supreme Court in D.C. versus Heller expressly noted that, quote, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. Gun rights are thus subject to regulation, just like any other rights. Sure, I don't know that anybody's actually arguing differently. What we're arguing is that even in a state of emergency, those rights cannot be infringed. Sure, you can regulate, but you cannot completely prohibit the exercise of that right to keep and bear arms. And unfortunately, what we've seen in some states is not that governors have said, listen, if you're a gun owner, you can't be one anymore. But what we have seen are governors say, listen, if you're not a gun owner, you can't be one for the foreseeable future. We don't know when you'll be allowed to be a gun owner. We know that you want to be a gun owner now, but we're telling you that you cannot become a gun owner. You cannot exercise your right to keep and bear arms because you're not allowed to acquire a firearm. And why aren't you allowed to acquire a firearm? Because we've closed the gun stores down. Again, that's not a regulation. That is an insurmountable burden on American citizens who are not currently exercising their right to keep and bear arms, but still possess their right to do so. Now, Professor Reyes goes on to say, quote, daily life vividly illustrates the extent to which many other rights have indeed been subject to regulation during the coronavirus pandemic. Keep in mind, again, we're not talking about regulations here, okay? Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Wolf originally ordered gun stores to close. He was sued. The Pennsylvania State Supreme Court actually said, yeah, he can do this because they sued actually over the entire emergency order. But he had 3 dissenting justices on the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court who said, actually, I don't know about this. This seems like you are really curtailing people's individual rights to keep and bear arms. And they actually suggested, look, why don't you allow gun stores to open by appointment only? They can clean the area where customers are in between visits. You could limit their hours. That way, again, these rights are not completely curtailed. That's what Governor Wolf agreed to do. And you have not seen any follow-up lawsuits. Because, yes, there are regulations. Yes, there are new burdens on these gun stores. But those individuals who are wanting to acquire a firearm still have the ability to do so. So we're not talking about regulations. We're talking about infringements, and Professor Reyes is playing some little linguistic games here with his argument. But let's go back to it. The First Amendment right to free exercise of religion, he says, is specifically enumerated in the Constitution. Yet there can be no doubt that this right is presently subject to significant limitations in the name of public health and safety. Gatherings of more than 10 people are prohibited under Governor Baker's order in Massachusetts, and no exceptions have been carved out for religious gatherings. The resulting burdens on religious exercise are keenly felt by many people, particularly as we approach the season of holidays like Easter and Passover. Other rights, he says, and freedoms have similarly been burdened. The right to travel has long been regarded as fundamental in Supreme Court jurisprudence, but limitations on that right abound in the current climate. People have been told not to leave their homes other than for essential trips. Hotels have been closed. New arrivals to states have been asked to self-quarantine for weeks. The right to suffrage is another example. The right to vote has often been described as one of the most fundamental of all freedoms insofar as it is the means of protecting other rights and liberties. Yet many jurisdictions have at least temporarily burdened that right by postponing their elections until the health crisis abates. All right. Let's discuss all of those issues, shall we? Yes, the First Amendment definitely has had some significant burdens placed on it over the past month or so. However, have you been told you can't pray? No, you have not. Have churches been told that they cannot broadcast their services online? No, they have not. You can still worship your God. You can still pray to the divine being that you worship. And by the way, if you're an atheist, nobody has compelled you to join a church, right? What about these other rights that he talks about? The right to travel, he says. I think this is actually a fascinating subject, and I wouldn't be surprised if we actually see some lawsuits over some of the burdens that we have seen placed on the right to travel. Dare County, North Carolina, which is the Outer Banks area, they are limiting entrance into the county to residents only. Gunnison County, Colorado is doing the same thing. They're not letting non-residents into that county. Frankly, I think that those are challengeable issues in court, and I would not be surprised if those decisions were actually ruled unconstitutional, because the freedom to travel is a right of Americans. Now, Professor Reyes goes on to say people have been told not to leave their homes other than for essential trips. Hotels have been closed. New arrivals to states have been asked to self-quarantine for weeks. Note, again, the language that's used here, asked, right? People have been asked not to leave their home except for essential businesses. People have been asked to quarantine for 2 weeks. And hotels closing down, not by order of the government, by the way, but because people are limiting their travel. In some cases, it may be because they've been asked to do so. In other cases, it may be because they're taking every precaution in order to not become infected with the coronavirus. But you can still travel. It may be a pain in the butt, but you can still travel throughout most of the United States. Professor Reyes says that the right to suffrage, another example, the right to vote has often been described as one of the most fundamental of all freedoms. Okay, again, nobody has curtailed your right to vote. We actually just saw an election in Wisconsin, and people were angry on the left that the election actually took place. Here in Virginia, where we do Bearing Arms Cam and Company every day, Governor Ralph Northam has a stay-at-home order that expires on June the 10th. Our primary is June the 9th. Governor Northam has said at the moment, I guess he's delayed this election now for a period of weeks, but the election is still going on. Nobody's talking about canceling elections, and there is no constitutional right to hold an election in May or on June the 9th, or even on the first Tuesday in November. Those are not constitutional requirements. Nobody has simply curtailed elections in this country. It is a false comparison that Professor Reyes is making. He goes on to say, quote, none of this is to suggest that all regulations and burdens on fundamental rights are permissible merely because we find ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic. The degree of the burden must always be balanced against the weight of the public interest, and some burdens may be too severe to withstand scrutiny. And then he gives his example, which has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. The attempt by some states, he writes, to suspend access to abortion services illuminates this point. A woman's fundamental right to terminate a pregnancy is one that by its nature is time-sensitive. The right must be exercised before the point of fetal viability, or it may be irreversibly lost altogether. By contrast, he writes, there is no correspondingly crucial time pressure associated with rights to purchase firearms. There is absolutely no evidence, he says, of rampant looting or breakdowns in social order that would even remotely support the argument that the exercise of Second Amendment rights demands immediate access to gun shops. Temporal burdens on abortion rights are thus different in kind from temporal burdens on other constitutional rights, for in the context of abortion, access delayed is access denied. Well, actually, in the case of all of our rights, access delayed is access denied, at least temporarily. And that is the question that is before some of these courts around the country right now, as to whether or not an open-ended delay. Again, right now, Professor Reyes could say all of these orders are temporary, but he can't tell you when gun stores are going to reopen again. He can tell you when Governor Baker right now says he believes gun stores are going to reopen again. But Governor Baker could turn around and say, now we're going to extend that order another month, or 2, or 3, or 6, depending on the circumstances, right? And according to Professor Reyes, that would be just fine. Here's the thing. Your Second Amendment rights do not depend on there being rampant rioting in these streets. And by the way, if we get to the point, and I hope that we don't, but if we get to the point that there is rampant rioting in the streets, might be a little late at that point to go and acquire a firearm, particularly if you live in a state with, let's say, a 10-day waiting period, right? The reason why we are seeing so many Americans at this moment choose to purchase a firearm, many of them for the very first time, is because they are concerned about the uncertain future. They don't know what the future is going to hold. We're looking in New York City, the epicenter of this coronavirus, with a fifth of the police force calling out sick. Violent crime has not disappeared around the country. We are still seeing gang-related shootings. We are still seeing home invasions. We'll still have an armed citizen story for you coming up here in just a few minutes. Violent crime has not stopped, and your right to keep and bear arms to protect yourself and the people that you love has not disappeared. It has not, and the need to exercise that right has not dissipated. Professor Reyes makes it seem like the only reason why we have the right to keep our arms is to protect ourselves against riots or civil unrest. That is one reason, but it is not the only reason. And again, your Second Amendment rights do not disappear during a pandemic, during a national emergency. I have to say, I find Professor Reyes' arguments very uncompelling. And I find his arguments, quite frankly, more of a political exercise in trying to justify these closures than an actual analysis of the constitutional issues at heart. Now, it's not just Professor Reyes. You've also got some politicians who are speaking up saying, why are these gun stores open anyway? In the state of Maryland, we had a delegate make some comments to that end. Karen Lewis is a delegate in Frederick County, Maryland. She doesn't understand why the gun stores are open. She told a local radio station, quote, that those people lining up in front of gun stores to purchase weapons appear to be stockpiling. And she says, if people are stockpiling, which they are, there's an indication of paranoia and perhaps panic. And that concerns me. You can't fight the coronavirus with a gun. That isn't going to do you any good. Really? No kidding. Thanks for that, delegate. Because that's the reason why I think so many Americans have been buying firearms, so that they could shoot the virus. Again, that is an idiotic argument, and that is not why people are buying firearms. They're not buying firearms and ammunition for the first time because they want to fight the coronavirus. They're buying firearms and ammunition for the first time because they are concerned about what the future might hold, as we should be, quite frankly. All right, now Delegate Young goes on to say that the increase in firearms puts a lot of vulnerable populations at danger. She says at vulnerable times when people are on edge, they're confined to their homes. This leads to a domestic violence spike, a suicide spike. Radio station said gun rights supporters say letters like these promote an anti-Second Amendment agenda. Delegate Karen Young takes issue with that. Quote, the First Amendment gives us the right to assemble, and we've put that aside for the safety of our constituents. Okay, so let's stop there for a second. It is true, public gatherings have been limited. In-person gatherings have been limited in many states. Yeah, in Virginia, public and private gatherings, no more than 10 people, according to the governor's order. Now, we haven't seen anybody arrested for violating those orders, and those orders are going to be really, really hard to enforce, which raises a whole other constitutional issue. But let's broaden this out a little bit. Your freedom to assemble. You might, even if you live in a state like Virginia, where the governor said no more than 10 people. Sorry, that's the limit. You can go online right now. You could assemble with 100 or 200 of your closest friends. You could get together online. You could use that online gathering to petition the government to redress your grievances. You can do these things. There are options. Can't do that when it comes to gun ownership. You cannot go online and buy a gun and have it shipped to your house. You can't do it. You need to go to the gun store. If you go online, you order directly from a manufacturer or a distributor, you're going to have that shipped to a federally licensed firearms retailer. You're going to have to go to that establishment. You're going to have to fill out the Form 4473. You're going to have to go through the background check before you can acquire that firearm. There's no way to do every bit of that online. If there was, probably wouldn't be an issue. We might not be having this conversation. But again, we're comparing apples to oranges here. Delegate Young also addressed the argument that those living in rural areas need guns for personal protection since law enforcement resources are limited and they need firearms to protect their livestock from predatory animals. He says, quote, people who live in rural areas have guns already. What's happening is stockpiling and paranoia, and this is something totally different. This is not business as usual. Well, despite what Delegate Young believes, not everybody who lives in a rural area is a gun owner, although gun ownership rates are a lot higher than they might be in places like, let's say legal gun ownership, a lot higher in Frederick County, Maryland, or the Western Maryland than it would be in Baltimore. But that doesn't mean that everybody has a firearm. I talked with my local gun store here in Farmville, Virginia, just a couple days ago. A couple of guys that work there, they're really busy in rural Virginia. And it's not just men and women who already own firearms who are coming in and saying, you know what, I'm going to get my 9th gun. There are people who are buying firearms for the very first time in rural parts of the country. But here's the thing. It's not a right of rural Americans. It's not a right of suburban Americans. It's a right of all Americans to keep and bear arms. So I don't really like the argument that, well, rural Americans need to be able to access firearms. No, every American, every law-abiding American needs to be able to exercise their right to keep and bear arms at this point in time. Yes, I'm glad that violent crime is down, or at least some categories of crime are down in many cities. That's not going to be a permanent feature. We know that. Police officers will tell you that. All right. It's again, I see these arguments. If you see any more of these arguments, feel free to send them my way at cam.edwards@bearingarms.com. I would love to take these down. But ultimately, this argument, whether it's Delegate, what was that delegate's name? Delegate Young from Maryland, or Professor Reyes up there in Massachusetts, ultimately what their argument boils down to is, I don't like the fact that people are exercising their right to keep and bear arms right now. I don't like the fact that we're seeing a lot of new gun owners coming out of these gun stores. This bothers me, and I think it should stop. That's their argument. And look, they're allowed to have that opinion. But it doesn't make it constitutional to prohibit Americans from accessing the ability to keep and bear arms during a state of emergency. All right, let's get now to our deal of the day, or our recidivist report, our armed citizen story, and our good deed of the day. As a matter of fact, our recidivist report comes from Maryland, not Frederick County, but Baltimore County, where a Baltimore man has been charged with murder in the fatal shooting of a 21-year-old in a city park. As it turns out, this guy, well known to law enforcement. The Baltimore Sun doesn't include this in its story, but Justin Fenton, who's a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, noted that this guy who was arrested on murder charges, Keith Gladden, well known to law enforcement. It was back in 2017, March of 2017, so 3 years ago. He was caught in possession of a firearm. It looked like it was like a single-shot Derringer, convicted and got 5 years because it was his 4th gun-related charge and his 3rd conviction. Now, by the way, he got 5 years 3 years ago, and he's already back out on the streets. In 2015, he was acquitted on firearm and drug charges. 2012, he pled guilty to an attempted murder charge and was sentenced to 9 years with 6 of them suspended, so he got a total of 3 years in prison. 2005, he pleaded guilty to assault with a 10-year sentence, 6 of them suspended. And again, now Gladden's been arrested and charged with killing 20-year-old Dontrell Tolliver 3 years after getting a 5-year sentence for illegal gun possession. Perhaps, I'm going out on a limb here, but perhaps if Mr. Gladden had actually had to do majority of the time that he was actually sentenced to, he would not have been on the streets. He would not currently be behind bars facing murder charges because he would still be behind bars on the illegal gun charges that he was convicted of. So there's your deal of the day. Our armed citizen story from Phoenix, Arizona, where a homeowner shot and wounded a suspected intruder. Looks like that intruder facing non-life-threatening injuries. Don't have a ton of information about this. Happened early Wednesday morning, just before 4 o'clock in the morning. Phoenix police officers got a call about a burglary. They actually responded. Keep in mind, a lot of departments right now are not responding to burglary calls, because that's considered a low-level offense, even if you happen to be at home. But in Phoenix, they did. And when they arrived, they found a man with a gunshot wound. Suspect taken to a hospital in serious condition, although, again, wounds not life-threatening. At this point, looks like as a case of self-defense, homeowner not believed to be facing any charges. We'll try to give you some updates as they become available, however. And finally today, we have our good guy from Quincy, Massachusetts, Officer Steve Kelly, getting some praise from the Quincy Police Department for helping a individual whose electric scooter had run out of electricity a quarter mile from his house. Officer Kelly ended up pushing that gentleman the quarter mile, and then not only that, helped him up to his fourth-floor apartment. The Quincy Police saying Officer Steve Kelly to the rescue. So in the right place at the right time, and able and willing to do the right thing. Officer Steve Kelly there in Quincy, Massachusetts, we thank you for your very good deed. That is all the time that we've got for you here on this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. Shout out to Bullets Both Ways out there in Colorado. Decided to I'm trying to wear more Second Amendment friendly shirts here. It's I'm stuck inside the house. I don't get to see anybody. I'm just feeling kind of we're all a part of the tribe of gun owners here, but sometimes when you're socially distancing, you can feel a little alone. So I feel a little bit closer to the men and women of Bullets Both Ways today. That is, again, going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company. We will be back tomorrow, however, with another edition of the latest Second Amendment news and information from all across the nation. Hope that you will tune in for that. You never have to miss a program, by the way. You can subscribe to Town Hall Media on YouTube or Bearing Arms Cam & Company on Apple Podcasts, and that way you get every show, or at least an alert when we get a new show for you each and every day. Thanks so much for being a part of today's program. If you have any questions or comments, shoot me an email, cam.edwards@bearingarms.com. We'll try to get to some of those on Friday's program as well. In the meantime, be well, be safe, be free. We'll see you here soon with another edition of Bearing Arms Cam & Company.